Hello, cruel world. My name is Dr. Shaham Das. I'm a consultant forensic psychiatrist. I assess mentally disordered offenders for a living so that you don't have to. 11 victims over a 2-week rampage, sexual assault, murder. He was dealt 33 life sentences. Joseph McCann committed one of the most heinous crime sprees on British soil in history. So, what was his upbringing like? What were the nature of his offences? What drove him? And what was the role that the mistakes that the authorities made, what role did that have in all of this? I will answer all of those questions and more in this episode of A Psych for Sore Minds. Also, I'm going to teach you about some psychiatric formulation. I'm going to talk about the 4 Ps that describe and categorize relapses of mental illness and also of violence, which are predispose, precipitate, perpetuate, and protective factors, inspired by the 5 Ds of dodgeball. I serenade whilst you vegetate. I educate while you vegetate. Other channels might tell you about the background of McCann case and other cases, but I'm training you to think like a forensic psychiatrist. So keep watching these videos, absorb my information and my knowledge, and who knows, one day you might be able to be my sidekick's butler. So let's first of all start off with a detail of McCann's recent crime spree. So it started off in Watford and then it moved to London and then the northwest towards Manchester in Cheshire. Cheshire, by the way, is where I grew up. It started on the 21st of April 2019. First, McCann abducted a 22-year-old girl at knife point when she was walking back from a nightclub. McCann was actually identified as the perpetrator the next morning, but the police couldn't find him. And then 4 days later, he abducted another woman in the North London area and subjected her to a horrific sexual assault. He also went to a drive-through with this woman in the car and she was still in there when McCann abducted another woman at knife point and forced her into the vehicle. He was drinking vodka throughout this whole time. Now I mention this because it's relevant to the formulation as you will see later. McCann then went to a hotel in Watford and tried to book in. He failed and then afterwards one of the women smashed a bottle of vodka over his head and they both escaped. It took a while for the police to link those crimes to the ones that he did before on the 21st of April, but then this national manhunt started. Then on the 5th of May, McCann met a woman in a nightclub and then he went back to her house and there he raped her 17-year-old daughter and her 11-year-old son. The daughter managed to escape and she ran for help, but by the time the police had come back to the flat, McCann had fled. McCann then grabbed another woman outside a supermarket and he attacked her and he raped her. Then he stole her car and whilst the woman was still in the car, he then kidnapped a 13-year-old girl and then he raped her. So I have to say, even just reading all of this out is quite sickening. But anyway, I will continue. They managed to escape at a service station later on that afternoon, but McCann continued using the stolen car. He went to Cheshire and he kidnapped 2 14-year-old girls and he threatened to kill them. And he carried on drinking vodka, carried on taking cocaine. At that point, he became, not surprisingly, the most wanted man in the country. The police finally spotted him in a stolen car with the 2 girls in the back and a kind of a car chase ensued. And it took 9 hours of chasing McCann from helicopters, car chase, also on foot before they finally caught him in the early hours of the morning of the 6th of May. And he was hiding up a tree at the time, which is a slightly slapstick finish to a horrific series of events. McCann entered a not guilty plea for the assault against all of his 11 victims, which is remarkable considering the amount of evidence against him. And he showed no remorse at all. In fact, he even tried to refuse to go to court, claiming that he was sleep deprived. But anyway, he got 33 life sentences and a minimum of 40 years in prison. And the judge branded him a clinical psychopath. So what are my opinions as a consultant forensic psychiatrist on this diagnosis? Was McCann a classic psychopath? Find out later in this episode. So altogether, McCann evaded the police for about 15 days and he used disguises, he used false names, and he was also being hidden and protected by various criminal associates. So in fact, 6 of his buddies were arrested for aiding and abetting him. All right, so let's step back a bit. Let's look at Joseph McCann's background. So what was his background? What was his upbringing? Well, McCann was born in London on the 8th of February 1985, which means that he has the same birthday as Kimbo Slice, the backyard bare-knuckle YouTube sensation, RIP, and also Seth Green, Dr. Evil's son. Sorry, there's just not that many famous people with that birthday. What do you want from me? McCann was a criminal prodigy, wreaking havoc on a council estate in Manchester by the age of 11. By 13, he was convicted for theft, and he had 2 brothers, and all 3 of them caused havoc until the council evicted the family in 1988. So I guess they were kind of like the Jonas Brothers of delinquency. Joseph McCann was a versatile criminal. He was carrying out knife attacks, criminal damage, he got charged with handling stolen goods, and all 3 of the brothers were given an 𝐭𝐴𝐲𝐻, which is an antisocial behavioural order. So basically that stops people from going into certain places to see certain people and to do certain activities, like antisocial activities such as graffiti. Breaking your 𝐭𝐴𝐲𝐻 can result in a fine or a community sentence or even a prison sentence of up to 5 years. Despite all of that, it seemed that the McCann brothers took pleasure in their 𝐭𝐴𝐲𝐻 because they were swearing at the cameras, and outside of court they were given what I doubt were accidental reversed peace signs. Interestingly, crime fell by 1/3 in this particular area. So McCann's criminality, in my view, is classic nature versus nurture. In fact, I've done another video on exactly that topic, nature versus nurture in violence. Go check it out. McCann later became a father, but he was in prison at the time of his child's birth and also his early years, which to me suggests a lack of responsibility. The reason I'm mentioning this is because it's potentially relevant for his diagnosis, which I'll come to later. Just trust me, I will explain everything. So McCann's criminal career continued into his adolescence, including burglary, threatening old people. He was actually sentenced to an IPP, which is an indeterminate prison sentence. So what is an IPP? Well, these are quite controversial and they were eventually banned. They started in 2005, they were abolished in 2012. So what it was basically intended to protect the public against criminals whose crimes were not quite serious enough to merit a whole life sentence, but they were regarded as too dangerous to be released. So even when their original sentence has expired, they were thought to be too dangerous. So after they were set a tariff, which means their prison sentence had ended, they had this indeterminate period, which basically lasts up until the parole board judges that prisoner to no longer pose a risk to the public and therefore is safe to be released. I hope that makes sense. So to me, it's kind of similar to a life sentence with a specific tariff. So I've mentioned this before in other videos. The specific tariff of a life sentence is the minimum amount of time that the prisoner has to spend in prison, or the earliest opportunity for them and their defense team to go in front of a parole board to try and convince the parole board that they're safe to be released. If you're interested, I've done a video on Colin Pitchfork, who was a horrible man who raped and killed 2 teenagers, was released recently by a parole board. I talk about all the decision-making process and all the kind of relevant factors. If you're interested, go check it out. But because I'm so good to you, very briefly, I will summarize like this. The prisoner has to prove that they've reduced their risk in prison by engaging in rehabilitation activities. McCann did that. We'll get back to that. And also that they've behaved themselves in prison, no altercations, no fights, no adjudications, and that they've got a stable environment to return to, such as accommodation or a job upon release. So basically what I'm saying is that the onus is on the prisoner as opposed to just having a period of time go past during their sentence. So dear viewers, let me know in the comments section what you think about an IPP. Are they fair? And also let me know if you want me to do another longer video on IPPs with some case examples. Anyway, back to McCann. His IPP started when he was arrested for burglary of an old man and he was sentenced in 2008. He was given a minimum of 2.5 years and then a 10-year license after his release. McCann was actually released in March 2017, and as I mentioned before, he actually did lots of rehabilitation courses in prison. But if I was cynical, which I am, it seems like he was just jumping through lots of hoops to get released, which he did. Which begs the question, does rehabilitation and therapy for violent offenders actually work? Well, you'll have to watch one of my other videos that I've done on this exact topic on this channel. Anyway, a few months after this, McCann was arrested again and he spent another 2 years in prison. So we're really getting the picture of a man who just has no remorse. He's got no intention of changing his ways. He doesn't care about going on the straight and narrow. He's all about the bent and wide. But for some bizarre reason, which I do not fully understand, the IPP was ignored and therefore McCann didn't have to go through those hoops that I was talking about, sitting in front of a parole board and proving that he's a decreased risk. Instead, he was just released from prison automatically halfway through his sentence to be put on license again in the community. He was released in 2019 and shortly afterwards he went on his horrific crime spree, which I've already told you about. So here's the educational bit. Pay attention, kids. So I'm going to teach you how to formulate this violence from the eyes of a forensic psychiatrist. We're going to talk about the 4 Ps: predisposition, precipitation, perpetuation, and protective factors. So in terms of predisposing factors, those are the historical factors that lead to violence. So let's look at McCann's early lifestyle. We know that he was criminally versatile from the age of 11. So not just one type of offence like somebody who just commits burglary, which wouldn't be that high risk, but lots of types of offences, from fires to knife crime to criminal damage to burglary. That kind of criminal versatility is more likely to result in violence and repeat offending down the line. Another factor in my view is McCann's criminal peers, including his own 2 brothers. So he grew up in a pro-criminal environment. So I think this almost gave him permission or even encouraged him to go on and offend, and it would kind of warp his moral fabric, if you were. If you're interested in those ideas and topics, then watch my other videos on why people commit crime. Okay, let's move on. In terms of precipitating factors, what is it exactly that sparked this crime spree? So in McCann's case, I'm afraid it's quite hard to say. There doesn't seem to be one specific reason. What I mean is, why did he suddenly decide to do it on that particular day as opposed to any other day in the past? I suppose you could argue that he always had the potential to go on such a crime spree, but the opportunity was lacking due to probation services and their pesky supervision and the fact that he was in prison for most of his adult life. And I suppose you could also argue that cocaine and alcohol could have been a precipitating factor because they cause disinhibition, they cause aggression in people who are vulnerable. I've done a whole video series on alcohol and offending, including telling you about real life cases of people I've assessed where alcohol has been a huge factor. Go check out those videos. But the counter argument of alcohol and cocaine as precipitating factors is that I'm sure McCann must have used those substances before, but this was the first time that he went on a crime spree of that magnitude. So what's next? Perpetuating factors. So these are the factors that meant that he continued his spree over the 15 days. So in formulation, perpetuating can be continuing violence in the long term over the years, or it can be continuing violence in the short term, which is what I'm about to talk about. So again, I think alcohol and cocaine perpetuated his violence. He continued to take these for days, which meant he's less likely to consider the eventual consequences of his actions. And also, I think that part of McCann knew he would eventually get caught and he would be in so much trouble that he probably thought, screw it, I might as well just continue doing what I want to do anyway. Got nothing to lose. I'll just face the consequences later. I'm probably going to get a bunch of life sentences. Who cares at this point? Also, I think he had a degree of instant gratification. So instant gratification is where you want pleasure now and you think about the consequences later. Just like you when you take that second slice of cake you greedy. And just like children when they do, well, practically anything really. I also think that the very fact that McCann was seemingly getting away with these horrific crimes day after day and he could easily escape, and his whole ability to evade the police using disguises, using false names, and of course using the people in his criminal network who helped him, I think this is all relevant because it would have emboldened him to continue. And in terms of protective factors, so those are the circumstances that would prevent future violence. Obviously, the biggest one is the fact that McCann is now in prison for a minimum of 40 years. And also that he's on license, or he will be on license when he is released, although clearly he didn't care about that in the past. So the next big question is, what went wrong? How could this have happened? And also, what is my diagnosis of McCann? Before I answer those questions, I'd like to formally introduce you to this channel. So you are watching A Psych for Sore Minds. My name is Dr. 𝐏𝐬𝐲𝐜𝐡 𝐅𝐨𝐫 I'm a consultant forensic psychiatrist. I assess mentally disordered offenders in courts and in prisons and in secure psychiatric units. This channel dissects a whole range of issues related to mental illness, some related to criminality, like this case, some not, because criminality is my area of expertise. I talk about individual diagnoses, I talk about high true profile cases, give my own psychoanalysis, I interview people. What I'm trying to say is there's something for everybody on this channel. And I implore you to subscribe, because not only does it help me out immeasurably, but it leaves no soapy residue on your dishes, guaranteed all your money back. So obviously one of the biggest issues was the fact that McCann didn't answer to his parole board before being released early in 2019, which was the conditions of his IPP. So that wasn't followed. And in addition, it seems like probation services didn't follow him up correctly. They didn't follow the procedures. For example, he frequently gave them the slip before he was caught, and probation services allowed this to happen or ignored it. The Ministry of Justice actually did their own review of this case, and they were highly critical of the National Probation Service. Now, I recently recorded a documentary series called Released to Kill, which will be on CBS Reality in November, in case you're interested. And during this, I spoke to some senior probation office officials, and there was a common theme for people who went on to kill, who'd been in prison and then had been released, followed up by probation. And that is that they weren't assessed and they weren't given appropriate secure accommodation. Though to be fair to them, for the people that I spoke to, they explained that this is all in relation to huge budget cuts, including merging of teams, so there just wasn't enough people to do so much more work. They weren't given enough support, enough guidance. As it can be seen in this case, the potential consequences can be unthinkable. So dear viewers, what do you think about the probation services? Are they to blame? Or is it the government's fault with their budget cuts? Or is it your fault for voting Tory? Anyway, so what was McCann's diagnosis? This is my area of expertise as a consultant forensic psychiatrist. As I mentioned before, the judge said he was a classic psychopath. See my videos on psychopaths if you want to learn more about what they are. I would actually, controversially, disagree with this diagnosis. So as I've talked about before on other videos, people wrongly assume that psychopaths is anybody who commits a high level of violence and lack kind of empathy. But that's not necessarily true. As you'll see in my psychopath videos, I actually worked for a man, my boss, who I'm pretty sure was a psychopath, but he committed no violence. Instead, psychopaths are charming, they're manipulative, they're deceitful. So the very fact that McCann needed to use a knife point to get people into his car rather than charming them or persuading them or conning them, to me, suggests that he doesn't have these factors. The one exception would be the woman who he went home with that night, but with respect, I'm not sure if you need that high level of charm and charisma or manipulation if you're in a dodgy nightclub at 3 in the morning. So obviously I've not assessed McCann in person, but with the information I have, instead, I think he fits the picture of antisocial personality disorder. I've done other videos on personality disorders, go check them out. So as well as the obvious features of lacking empathy, not caring about the rights of others, not caring about right and wrong, using violence and aggression, being impulsive, which as I said was probably fueled by cocaine and alcohol. Despite all of that, McCann also had the less obvious subtle features, such as lack of responsibility, including not being there to raise his son whilst he was in prison. And another huge feature for me is that he repeatedly didn't learn from his mistakes. So being under probation, being sent to prison repeatedly, it just didn't change his behavior. So that is all, to me, antisocial personality disorder. So to conclude, obviously this is a tragic case, one of the largest manhunts in UK history. And I have to say, as a parent, it's an absolute nightmare for the thought that your children could just be walking around the streets during the day and they could be kidnapped by this monster at knife point by somebody like McCann. So I do hope this video helps you kind of piece together some of the psychiatric diagnoses and formulations that a professional forensic psychiatrist like myself would use. However, I'd just like to say we absolutely cannot forget about the horrific trauma and the ordeal that his numerous victims have suffered. That's at the heart of this case. And it's easy to blame services, and to a degree that's probably fair, but we also have to take into consideration the wider social impact of budget cuts. The National Probation Services simply had too much work to do and not enough resources. And just going off piste a little bit, I see something similar in mental health services. services. We are underpaid, we're overstretched, and the consequences are slow and subtle, just like the gradually boiling frog who doesn't know he's being boiled alive. From what I've seen, people suffer with mental illness, and it's more severe and it's more longer because our services don't have enough funding. I've actually done a video on a man called Adam Stanmore, tragic case, committed suicide because of poor mental health treatment. So please go check out that video, it is fascinating. For me personally, it's not about who to blame, but it's about understanding how this could have happened to try and prevent it in the future. And as horrific as McCann's alcohol and cocaine-fueled, sexually deprived crime spree was, of course, we should remember that this is extremely rare. Basically, what I'm trying to say is I hope I haven't given you nightmares. Before we finish, I just want to quickly shout out my book. It's going to be called In Two Minds, going to be released in March next year. A bit like this channel, but more of a deep dive, more scientific, more autobiographical. You should go cop it, it's going to be awesome. Until next time, stay euthymic, please spread the love and tell people about this channel. I could do with more subs. And remember, whatever happens, do not forget, I love you.